Commander Holy Ghost declares that April 2025 will be the final April in which Nigeria exists within Biafran territory, and the last Eastern Nigerians and Biafrans will celebrate together. He claims the Nigerian government falsely accused Prime Minister Simon Ekpa of inciting violence and sponsoring terrorism, but failed to provide any evidence to back these charges. He says Nigeria's main goal was to extradite Simon Ekpa from Finland by spreading propaganda, but the Finnish authorities rejected their efforts due to lack of proof. Commander Holy Ghost defends Simon Ekpa, stating that self-determination and self-defense are not crimes under international law, and urges Biafrans to stand by their Prime Minister. He criticizes the Nigerian army for trying to recruit Biafran youth, arguing that Nigeria offers no meaningful future or leadership positions for Biafrans in any major sector. He warns that any Biafran who joins the Nigerian army is effectively signing a death warrant and calls on youth to instead enlist in the Biafran Restoration Army, which he describes as the only trustworthy force in Africa. He accuses a man named Owen Kerry of being a paid agent of the Nigerian government, allegedly working to stop Biafra's independence declaration. Commander Holy Ghost issues a personal warning to a critic he calls VAM, telling him to stop mentioning his name or face, a direct response, while stressing that he respects elders but will defend himself. He claims Nigerian officials like Musa and Bianolu are afraid to travel to Finland because they cannot defend the allegations they brought against Simon Ekpa. He urges Biafrans to ignore what he calls lies from certain individuals, remain resolute in their cause, and promises that the Biafran liberation is already unfolding. On the 17th of April 2025, Commander Holy Ghost, a senior officer in the Biafran Restoration Army, addressed his followers with a declaration he said would reshape the history of the lands claimed by the Republic of Biafra. He began by underlining the date, inviting everyone who heard him to note that this was more than a passing remark. He insisted that this April would be the final time that the Federal Republic of Nigeria would stand within the borders that the Republic of Biafra claims as its own. He spoke with conviction, reminding his listeners of the long years since the Nigerian Civil War, which spanned from 1967 to 1970, when the Republic of Biafra first declared independence. He evoked the memory of that period, acknowledging the suffering and hope that have defined generations of Biafrans. By asserting that this would be the last Easter festival celebrated jointly by Nigerians and Biafrans, he drew on the deep emotional resonance of that religious observance in a region where Christianity binds many communities. He framed the coming Easter not only as a shared spiritual event, but as the closing moment of a chapter in which Nigerians and Biafrans have lived side by side under a single national flag. His words carried a sense of finality, as if he were drawing a line beneath decades of conflict and longing. As I listened to Commander Holy Ghost, I felt the weight of that historical struggle pressing against his voice, and I could sense how much this proclamation meant to people who have carried the dream of self-rule through years of negotiation, peaceful protest, and at times armed resistance. He invited his audience to see April 2025 not just as another month, but as a turning point when the political reality in southeastern Nigeria, comprising Imo State, Anambra State, Enugu State, Abia State, and Ebonyi State, would irrevocably change. Immediately after that dramatic opening, Commander Holy Ghost turned to the allegations brought by the Federal Republic of Nigeria against Prime Minister Simon Ekpa of the Biafran government in exile. He reminded his audience that the Department of State Services in Abuja had accused Prime Minister Simon Ekpa of inciting violence and financing terrorism within the Federal Republic of Nigeria. He said those charges were circulated in an effort to brand the movement for Biafran independence as a criminal enterprise. He pointed out that neither the security agencies in Abuja nor the attorneys acting on behalf of the Nigerian government had ever produced a shred of evidence to substantiate their claims. He noted that the officials in Abuja alleged that Prime Minister Seaman Ekpa was traveling around Europe to solicit weapons and funds to foment unrest in southeastern Nigeria, but he emphasized that no documentation, witness testimony, or material proof had ever been presented to any court or independent investigator. He suggested that this lack of evidence was not accidental but intentional, because the Nigerian authorities understood that a prima facie case would never hold up in a fair judicial system. As he spoke, Commander Holy Ghost expressed frustration that these serious allegations had made headlines in Nigerian newspapers and on state-affiliated television stations despite the absence of any factual basis. He described the accusations as a smear campaign and urged his listeners to recognize them for what they were: a political maneuver designed to undermine the legitimacy of the Biafran government in exile and to tarnish the reputation of its prime minister. Commander Holy Ghost then explained how the Nigerian government carried those unsubstantiated charges to the Helsinki Criminal Court and to the Ministry of Justice in Helsinki, hoping to secure an extradition order for Prime Minister Seaman Ekpa. He said that Mr. Seaman Ekpa had been living in Helsinki, Finland, under the protection of Finnish authorities who had granted him residency in recognition of his political advocacy. The commander described how emissaries from the Federal Republic of Nigeria had traveled to Finland, armed with pamphlets, newspaper clippings, and transcripts of speeches, insisting that these materials constituted proof of Mr. Seaman Ekpa's involvement in terrorist activity. He noted that those envoys appeared in the offices of the Finnish Ministry of Justice with impressive confidence, expecting Finnish legal experts to rubber-stamp their request. Yet, Commander Holy Ghost pointed out, the Finnish authorities immediately recognized that the so-called evidence was nothing more than second-hand media reports and political rhetoric. He recounted how Finland's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and its legal advisors informed the Nigerian representatives that Finland required concrete, admissible proof, material documents, credible witness statements, forensic verification, or digital records before considering an extradition request. Commander Holy Ghost emphasized that the Finnish government gave the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Nigeria 6 months to produce anything beyond hearsay, and that deadline was set to expire in May 2025. He reminded his followers that when those 6 months ended, there was still nothing to show. No bank records, no intercepted communications, no certified translations of speeches, no reliable testimony. As I heard him outline this diplomatic exchange, I understood the depth of his relief. He used the story to demonstrate that international law, when applied correctly, protects political activists from baseless persecution. He praised Finland's commitment to due process and contrasted it with what he called the arbitrary tactics of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. From there, Commander Holy Ghost shifted to an explanation of the legal principles that he said excused Prime Minister Seaman Ekpa from wrongdoing under any recognized system of international law. He spoke about the right to self-determination, which he described as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations and declared to be a fundamental freedom by several resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly. He reminded his listeners that self-determination is the right of a people to choose their own political status and pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. He said that this right cannot be criminalized by any state, and that no person advocating for the independence of the Republic of Biafra could lawfully be prosecuted for making speeches, organizing rallies, or seeking international support. Commander Holy Ghost also spoke about self-defense, which he clarified was a right recognized under Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations. He explained that self-defense allows parties to respond if they face armed aggression. but that it does not apply here because the struggle for independence has so far relied on non-violent means. In his view, the Federal Republic of Nigeria had overreached by attempting to label peaceful advocacy as terrorism. He invited his audience to reflect that if simply calling for independence were a crime, then every freedom movement in the world would face identical charges. He reminded them that supporters of independence in East Timor, Eritrea and South Sudan had all been deemed criminals by colonial powers or by central governments. Yet international law ultimately sided with their right to form their own states. As he spoke, I could sense that he intended to reassure his followers that their cause was just and protected by an international consensus that transcends the walls of any courtroom or the declarations of any government ministry. After addressing the legal aspects, Commander Holy Ghost turned to a warning for young people in southeastern Nigeria who had been targeted by recruitment drives organized by the Nigerian army. He said that recruiters from the Nigerian military had arrived in towns and villages, offering training, uniforms, and the promise of a steady salary. They told parents that this would be a career path that offered opportunities in engineering, logistics, medical service, and even positions in the Department of State Services. Commander Holy Ghost recounted how these recruiters held rallies in local community centers and in front of university auditoriums, sometimes accompanied by banners bearing the crest of the Nigerian army and the coat of arms of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. He described how officials from the Ministry of Petroleum Resources and from the Nigeria Customs Service had also approached job seekers, suggesting that young Biafrans might find fulfilling roles in the oil and gas industry or in international trade. But Commander Holy Ghost warned his listeners that these promises were empty. He said that once recruits took the oath of enlistment with the Nigerian army, they would find themselves stationed at remote bases in the northern part of the country, far from their homes and families. He cautioned that few of the positions were permanent, that many contracts were short-term and renewable only with political influence, and that promotions were nearly impossible without connections to senior officers in Abuja. He insisted that the risk of death or injury was high, drawing on news reports of Biafran-born soldiers arrested on suspicion of suspected sabotage, only to disappear into military detention. His message was clear. Any young person from the southeastern region who joined the Federal Republic of Nigeria's armed forces was effectively signing a death warrant with no chance of redemption. Having laid out the dangers of signing up with the Nigerian Army Commander Holy Ghost then offered an alternative. He called on young people to enlist in the Biafran Restoration Army. He spent time describing that organization as the sole legitimate military force dedicated entirely to the defense of the people of the Republic of Biafra. He said that the Biafran Restoration Army recruits from across the region, offering formal training in leadership, supply chain management, medical care, and strategic planning. He claimed that those who joined received uniforms bearing the emblem of a rising sun over a green field and enjoyed a sense of purpose that could not be matched elsewhere. He explained that the facilities for recruits are funded by donations from the Biafran diaspora, from private benefactors in Europe and North America, and from charitable organizations that support peaceful self-determination movements. He said that unlike the Federal Republic of Nigeria, which relies on coercion and political patronage, the Biafran Restoration Army operates transparently, with clear records of expenditure and with a chain of command that answers to the elected leadership of the Biafran government in exile. As he painted this picture, I could hear the pride in his voice. He wanted his listeners to see that joining the Biafran Restoration Army was not just an act of defiance, but a step toward building institutions that could one day govern an independent state. He invited everyone who heard him to consider whether they would rather risk their lives in a force that had no interest in developing the southeastern region, or join one that claimed to place the welfare of its members and their families at the center of its mission. After urging Biafran youth to rally behind the Biafran Restoration Army, Commander Holy Ghost turned his attention to a middle-aged man named Owen Kerry, whom he described as a criminal in the employ of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. He said that Mr. Owen Kerry had been paid by Abuja's security services to use social media, radio interviews, and online videos to denounce the independence movement. He accused Mr. Owen Kerry of spreading false claims that the Biafran government in exile intended to commit mass violence against Nigerian civilians if independence were achieved. Commander Holy Ghost asserted that these lies were intended to alarm international observers and to give the Federal Republic of Nigeria an excuse to block the recognition of the Republic of Biafra at the United Nations. He challenged Mr. Owen Kerry to provide evidence for any of his allegations, declaring that until Mr. Owen Kerry could prove that he had not been paid by Nigerian security operatives, his reputation would remain that of a paid agent. He issued a direct invitation for anyone who doubted his account to follow the money trail, to examine bank statements or agreements with the Department of State Services, and to verify whether Mr. Owen Kerry had actually received funds to smear the independence cause. As he spoke, I sensed a mixture of contempt and defiance in his tone. He wanted to strip away the veneer of legitimacy that Mr. Owen Kerry tried to project, and to expose him as a tool of the Federal Republic of Nigeria's campaign against Biafra. From that point, Commander Holy Ghost delivered a personal warning to a fellow activist who goes by the name VAM. He addressed this individual with a mix of respect and firmness. He said that he valued the contributions of his elders and of anyone who took an interest in the struggle, but that he would not tolerate reckless attacks on his own character or on the leadership of the Biafran government in exile. He asked Mr. VAM to stop mentioning his name in public discussions, to refrain from making unauthorized statements about the Biafran Restoration Army, and to cease analyzing his actions through gossip and speculation. Commander Holy Ghost reminded Mr. VAM that despite the disagreements between them, he respected him as a senior member of the movement. Yet he insisted that any further references to his person without permission would be met with a direct response. He explained that this was not a threat, but a boundary, a way of preserving order and focus within the movement. He said that while he would always defer to tradition and show courtesy to his predecessors, he would not shy away from defending his own honor when it was challenged unfairly. In that moment, I understood that internal disputes and personality conflicts had surfaced among some activists in the diaspora, and that Commander Holy Ghost was determined to maintain unity by drawing clear lines around acceptable public discourse. Turning once more to the International Front, Commander Holy Ghost addressed the fate of two high-ranking officials from the Federal Republic of Nigeria, named Major General Christopher Musa and Mr. Patrick Bianolu. He claimed that these officials were so fearful of the risk of public embarrassment and legal challenge that neither of them would consent to travel to Helsinki, Finland. He said they knew that if they set foot in the Finnish capital, they would be summoned to testify before courts and independent investigators about the accusations they had leveled against Prime Minister Simon Ekpa. He argued that Major General Christopher Musa and Mr. Patrick Bianolu were aware of the lack of evidence in their extradition dossier and that they dared not risk cross-examination under oath. Commander Holy Ghost contrasted their refusal to appear in Helsinki with the courage of his own leadership, who, he said, had no fear of the truth. He challenged his listeners to ask whether the officials in Abuja would defend their narrative in an open court, and he asserted that their silence spoke volumes. As I reflected on this assertion, I considered the diplomatic implications. If those officials truly avoided traveling to Finland for fear of legal humiliation, then it illustrated the chasm between the claim of sovereignty that the Federal Republic of Nigeria insisted upon and the due process standards that Western democracies uphold. In the final portion of his address, Commander Holy Ghost spoke directly to every person who identified as a Biafran. He urged them to disregard the false statements spread by Mr. Owen Kerry, Mr. Vam, and other critics who he said were either misinformed or maliciously funded. He called on them to remain steadfast in their belief that the cause of Biafran independence was unassailable under the principles of justice and human rights. He painted a picture of the future Republic of Biafra as a land where infrastructure would be rebuilt, where children would receive quality education in their own language, where hospitals would be staffed and stocked without interference from distant authorities, and where the riches of the oil-producing region would enrich local communities instead of lining the pockets of political elites in Abuja. He insisted that this vision was already unfolding in the training camps of the Biafran Restoration Army, in the diplomatic engagements of the Biafran government in exile, and in the growing cultural renaissance that he said was sweeping through cities like Enugu and Onitsha. He closed by thanking his audience for their loyalty, invoking a blessing from God for their families, and promising to return with more news as events continued to develop. His final words echoed with the same certainty that had opened his speech, that April 2025 would mark the end of one era and the beginning of another, and that the dream of an independent Republic of Biafra was no longer a distant hope, but a movement already in motion. As I step back from recounting Commander Holy Ghost's address, I see a tapestry woven from conviction, historical memory, legal argument, and strategic warning. He used the symbolic power of Easter, the weight of international law, and the reality of youth recruitment to craft a message that was equal parts inspiration and caution. He framed the struggle for independence not as an abstract ideal, but as a living campaign that demands both moral clarity and practical commitment. By declaring that this would be the last April that Nigerians and Biafrans would share under one flag, he fired a shot across the bow of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, signaling that the time for compromise was over and that the era of decisive action had begun. His words challenged listeners to examine their own loyalties and to choose between uncertain promises from a distant government and a cause that claimed to hold the keys to their future. Whether one views Commander Holy Ghost as a visionary, a nationalist, or a controversial figure, there is no denying that his declaration has reverberated far beyond the borders of southeastern Nigeria. It has sparked debate in diplomatic circles, drawn attention from international human rights organizations, and left both supporters and opponents wondering what will unfold when the calendar turns to May 2025 and the deadline for evidence expires. In that moment, history may well record whether Commander Holy Ghost's promise of a final April will stand as an enduring prophecy or as a bold statement of intent that reshaped the trajectory of a people long in search of self-determination. This is the end of our news update. Please click the icon on the top right corner of your screen to watch my next video. You will enjoy it. I will see you again in my next update. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye for now.